My name is Bree Gertler. I am the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs here at the University of Virginia. I'm also a professor of philosophy. And thank you for joining the session on generative AI in teaching and learning. I'm delighted to be joined by three members of the 2023 Task Force on Generative AI in Teaching and Learning. Gabrielle Bray, who is UVA class of 23. She graduated in the spring with a double major in history and Jewish studies, and she served in her fourth year as chair of the honor committee. Reza Mousavi, assistant professor of commerce in the McIntire School of Commerce, and Andrew Pennick, associate professor of public policy in the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. So thanks to all of you for joining us today and for serving on the task force. Andy, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah.
Will you give us a little bit of background about this issue? And I will say that I was not aware of generative AI until November of 2022, like everyone else. But I think Andy had his antenna up before then and certainly acted soon after it rose to the surface.
Yeah, I did. My best friend works at Google, and so we've been talking about generative AI for a number of years and was following some conversations on Twitter, particularly as ChatGPT rolled out in the education space. And so in November, I was starting to see a lot of tweets. I was starting to roll it out in my own classroom. Students' jaws were dropping. I was talking to faculty, how are we going to get ahead of this? And then I wrote the Center for Teaching Excellence, and I said, hey, I'm really eager to learn from you guys. What are we going to do about this? And they wrote me back and said, what do you think we should do? And I took an hour that's changed my life, or at least over the last year, and I said, well, I typed out a plan, and they said, great, why don't you execute that for us? And I was like, oh, darn. And so at the start of the spring semester, the day before classes started, Michael Palmer, who is the director of the CTE, and I had a seminar for about 100 faculty. We just walked through some of the basics of what it is, how it might impact our current learning designs. And that was a Wednesday. On Friday, Michael and I were in front of the associate deans. On the following Wednesday, we were in front of the deans, the president, and the provost. And out of that, the provost charged Bree to assemble a committee that would look at how is generative AI going to impact the teaching and learning at the university across all the different schools and all the different disciplines. And that's ultimately the committee that the three of us ended up serving on.
Yes, and I will say that that committee did excellent work. They held 6 town hall meetings with a total of over 300 faculty attending those meetings. They did a survey and got responses from over 500 students. I'm looking at all three of you to keep me honest here. So it was a deep level of engagement with the UVA community. They also consulted peer institutions to find out how our peers were responding to this. And they wrote an excellent report, which I recommend. It's available on the Provost Office website. If you just Google the name of this session and UVA, you will find it. The report is very forward-looking. There are tones that are a bit ominous in there, but overall, I think it's a wonderful primer on what this technology could mean for the future of higher education. So I'm going to start us off with the first round of questions, and then I want to open it up to all of you. I'm sure all of you have thought about how higher education will be affected by this technology, whether you are a faculty member, a staff member, a parent, a student. It probably is something that you're thinking about. But I want to start with Gabrielle. As I said, Gabrielle graduated in the spring. Congratulations.
Congrats.
But she's the closest thing that we have on this panel to a student, so I'm going to ask her a question from the student's perspective. And that is, how are you and your friends who are just finishing up their undergraduate education or maybe moving on to graduate school, how are they thinking about this technology, and what do they wish that their professors knew about this technology?
That's a good question. I think students are vastly creative in the ways that they are using generative AI. And because of that, there are a lot of issues raised about what are the ethical ways to use it, and how can it be used in academia. And so I think they wish that their faculty knew how to have the conversation with them about what the guidelines around AI use will be, because it will vary by class and by discipline. I think a lot of students are trying to balance the fact that generative AI is something that those of us entering the workforce will be expected to know how to use, but that our faculty and our future employers will also expect us to know how to do good work on our own. And so I think we wish faculty knew how to have that conversation with us.
Great. Thanks.
Can I follow up on that just briefly?
Sure. Yes.
If you haven't followed some of the really interesting research, I'm not a technologist. I just play one up at stages like this. But one of the really interesting pieces of research that's come out recently was a Harvard, MIT, and Wharton study that looked at the Boston Consulting Group. In the Boston Consulting Group, they took 7% of their workforce, randomized it into AI access and non-AI access, and said, which of these, and then they had a series of tasks that they pre and post tested on, so a good randomized control trial. And with real world professionals doing real world work, they scored 50% higher on performance and did it at 50% the speed. And that's not writing code, that's not being technical, that's just the normal stuff that a Boston Consulting Group, which is what many of my students are going on to do. So we have this real world evidence that I think Gabby's pointing us to about why students are legitimately so interested in these things, because they can really see the impact in the workforce, not just within data science, but also in fields without it. And I think that's a lot of what's driving, at least for my students in the Batten School, their interest and experience with it in the classrooms today.
Great, so that sets me up nicely for my question to Reza. Reza looks at AI and business analytics, and so I wanted you to tell us what you think are the one or two most important things for our students to know about AI as they prepare to start their working lives when they leave our grounds.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. So I think for me, as I think about my own students, the most important thing would be to figure out, like, among the things they want to do at their own jobs, what are the kind of tasks that they can substitute using generative AI or like AI in general, and what are the kind of tasks that they can augment using generative AI? And I think that would inform them in terms of, like, as they are picking up the skills, as they're going through the programs they're in, that would actually help them a lot to be prepared for the job market, because as Andy mentioned, I don't think there is any question that the employers would expect the employees to use these set of tools to be more efficient, to be more productive. It's just that to kind of figure out, for all the things that, you know, a worker is sort of involved with, what are the kind of things that they can automate and like kind of like leave to generative AI in a very responsible, in a very, I guess, with the same quality of work, and then what are the kind of things that would augment them. And I can actually see this in my own sort of work, like writing a paper is obviously a very time-consuming process. So you do the study, you collect the data, you analyze the data and things like that. And then at some point you have to write it down. So if you wanted to write down every sentence, if you wanted to proofread everything, it would have been a more time-consuming process, excuse me. But if I can write down what I think is my main message, and then use these types of technologies to kind of polish them, make them more digestible, make them more, I guess, engaging, then I can use that time and then conduct like a couple more studies. Maybe I can test a few more theories and things like that. I think that's kind of like, in my own job, the way I look at it is that, from all the things I'm engaged in, what are the kind of things that would benefit from this thing, and what are the kind of things that I have to kind of do it myself, just because, I cannot trust these types of tools to take over.
Right. Thank you. Okay, and now a question for Andy. So the task force looked at ways that students are already using this technology to help them study, to help them learn. Could you talk about a few of those ways?
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting ways that I've seen students use AI is as a tutor. And so, there are some very nice prompts online that prompt the bot to say, I am going to tutor you in ways that will not give you the answers that bring you to the edge of your understanding. Like, let's say they're learning microeconomics. Say I'm about to take an exam on public goods theory, and you would say, give me questions that will allow you to ascertain, do I actually know what I'm talking about? If I do, make the questions harder and more complex. If I don't, correct me and make them easier, and then tutor me from there. So I think some students are using it in ways that are substituting directly for, say, TAs, which might not be accessible at all times. I'm certainly old and go to sleep at 10:30. They're often studying till 2, and so the AI is accessible at all those times. They're also using it, in addition to tutoring, they're coming up with exams. So many of my students are saying, here's a practice exam from the professor, write 3 other practice exams so that I can begin to execute on more problems that mimic the kind of problem that I'm being asked here, and then give me feedback on whether or not I'm doing that correctly. Is that always going to give a perfectly accurate result? No, but I do know students who are studying in those ways, which I think are really interesting. And those are at least in line with our current learning objectives. I think what Reza is bringing up is this idea that there are ways in which what we were teaching students to do, particularly in professional schools, is no longer resonant with the reality of where they'll be in the workplace. And at that point, what it means to study is to have, I think, a conversation with the professors and a conversations with the workplace about how do we prepare ourselves to do the kind of task with the tools that are available. And therefore, studying, writing a master's thesis this semester looks a lot different than writing a master's thesis last semester. They're studying, they're doing the work of the class, but the work is in some ways, the process of the work is different, even if the final outcome is not.
Great. Well, at this point, I'd like to turn to the audience. If you have questions, we've got a few people walking around with microphones. So if you've got a question for our panel, please raise your hand.
Hello again. Thank you for speaking today. I'm curious it's hard to tell from the outside how much generative AI is currently really being used by students specifically. Like, you hear stories, but I've also heard from professor friends, they're surprised that students are not using it that much. So I'm curious what your take is on how much this is actually, penetrated into use by students, et cetera. Thank you.
Do y'all remember the numbers from the study?
I think it's actually, from what I remember, it's like about 80%, I think. But the problem, though, is they don't know whether the instructors are okay with them using this, and they're afraid of being violating the the honor code and things like that. And the other thing that I kind of obtained from my own students is that in many cases they do not want to use this tool just because they don't know the foundations, and it basically doesn't make them to go one step above that and then have this tool give them the things that they need for doing something. So they really want to have the foundation. They really want to know how things work. What is the definition of critical thinking within that classroom? Once they figured it out, they're comfortable with that. I think they are then okay with using these types of tools to kind of be more productive, to learn more topics, to learn more advanced topics. So I think that's kind of the impression I got from my own students. I think, Gabby, you probably would have a lot more insight just because you were a student not long time ago.
I think students are very aware, at least in the semester where there was so much conversation happening around AI, that there is a risk of AI if you just ask it a question and ask it to write you something, that you are going to get bad scholarship. ChatGPT, at least when I was a student, didn't necessarily have access to the most recent research, to things that students would be expected to know. And so I don't think you were seeing I'd like to believe you weren't seeing a lot of essays that were just generated by AI whole cloth. What I do see students using AI for are summarizing a complicated reading that they don't want to spend their whole day on, or proofing an essay after they have already written it. And so those ways of using AI aren't necessarily as obvious to faculty, but they are still, I think, interesting issues for academia to work out.
Great.
I'd be curious to hear any of your recommendations on building an environment of safety and trust to have that conversation. I was struck by Gabriella's opening comment about, I wish the teachers could have known how to engage and talk with us, because I need to develop policy on how it should be used. And I don't know how to create a safe enough place where people can talk about, this is what I'm really using Gen AI for. You know, we don't know how to approach that. So very curious on recommendations to build trust and then yield effective policy that everybody can happily adopt.
So I will say one thing, just because in the provost's office, we developed some guidance around this. And in that guidance, we suggested that you begin with having an open, frank conversation with your students to really model curiosity about this technology, to model not being technophobic, and to engage them and say, look, here are my learning objectives for the course. Here is what I hope you will learn when you do this assignment and why I designed it that way. Now, what do you think the rules should be about using AI? That's not to say that you wouldn't necessarily allow them to make those rules, but I think those kinds of conversations can really go a long way in earning trust with your students.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And I think part of what's tricky for non-technologists is that many of us feel behind the students, and we are in the UVA classroom because we're experts, and there's this thing that we're not expert at that they might be more expert at. But I think the ability to model interaction and humility with it, it does get things wrong, and to be able to say, how do we deal with a hallucination here when they happen? I also think that it requires a humility and a willingness to give up ways that we've been teaching for a long time. I'm really struck by Gabby's reading point. One of my big fears is that students will stop reading articles, because I think there's something about sitting with an idea for many pages and maybe an hour of sitting with it that, sure, ChatGPT can, or Claude, students are using Claude for this because the uploads for PDFs are so much faster. Here's 2 articles, synthesize them, write me 3 things I could say in class to look smart in front of my professor. Done. And they don't want to say that to us, but we actually need to be able to hear that, because if that's the reality, then I have to design a new way of learning for them, because I do think it's important to sit with those ideas for longer than just Cliff Notes are not a great way to inculcate the lessons of Jane Austen for a reason, right? Like, you need to sit through Pride and Prejudice and hear it all in its format. That's what makes it beautiful and impactful. And I think we'll lose some of that. And so I think students are scared of telling us that. And I think open conversation is the best way to go about having that. But that does take a level of trust on both sides that is hard to build.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
If I could just add one more thing, I think that the problem is a bit more complex than just having a very transparent policy. Just because, let's say I'm an instructor, I want my students to use generative AI to kind of automate some of the tasks, like the programming part of it, just because I'm interested in them learning, how to approach the data to create business value. That's the main thing I want them to learn in my class, right? The problem is when they get into my class, they have taken other classes, right? And the instructors, depending on what the learning objectives were in those classes, they had their own policy, right? So when the students come into my class, they have been exposed to generative AI, how they can use it at a varying level. So it's not like, they all know exactly the same way to use it. So I think that's the other complexity that would kind of, make this decision, or having a unified policy a little bit more problematic, just because there's so many heterogeneity in this.
I think at UVA, and we have a strong sense of honor, and that honor is an important both value and institution at UVA. And I think in some contexts, students are afraid of talking with their faculty about what might be perceived as an honor violation without establishing at the outset that this is not a conversation that is going to lead to a report. Honor is at least the way our system is set up, we rely firmly on what faculty define as academic integrity violations in our cases. So the policy from the honor committee thus far has been that if a faculty member says that a use of artificial intelligence is an honor violation, that is the understanding of that we will back. And so I think you can have that conversation with your students that there's not a hard and fast honor policy here, and it is something that you can develop together.
Yeah, so I understand that at UVA, each course has the responsibility to set clear expectation for the use of these AI tools. There are undoubtedly many courses that are ready to embrace them fully, which raises some of accessibility question. If you compare ChatGPT 4 to a 3.5, there's a monthly subscription, and I've heard in a previous panel that the university is thinking about getting, access to faculty, staff, students, maybe even undergrad students. So could you elaborate where we are in that process?
I think that one's for me. So we are actively working on getting an institutional license, and we're doing that for the reason that you cite, which is we want to ensure that all of our students have equitable access to the same technology, which would be the 4.0 as opposed to the free 3.5. We're also doing that because our current guidance as a university is that faculty members should not require students to create their own accounts, because if you create your own account, you have to share personal information such as a cell phone number, and we don't want our students to be forced to do that as a condition of taking a course. Also, currently, when you upload your own work to one of these platforms, at least ordinarily, it's then used to train the data set, right? And students' work is their own intellectual property, and so for that reason, we say they should not be required to use a tool if that means uploading it to the data set. So all of these issues about equity, about security, about intellectual property are kind of pushing us to adopt an institutional license. I will only share that the way of funding it and the cost structure for it is surprisingly complex, and surprising because I think our peer institutions are all in the same situation that we are. So I'm hoping that that evolves over time, but I think that very, very soon we will have an institutional license. What I don't know is exactly what the funding structure is going to look like.
Andy, I wanted to follow up on something you said before. You told the story about the BCG study, and I think every panel today we've heard someone's give us the line that you're not going to lose your job to AI, you're going to lose your job to someone who knows how to use AI. And I think that's likely true. And so I guess I'm wondering if the committee or the task force in the work, especially in the professional schools that you alluded to, tried to understand from the employers, especially the first destination employers, whether it's BCG or wherever else, how those roles are changing now. Because I can't imagine that BCG, having secured the data that they did on, whatever 30 to 50% productivity, are now saying, well, we're not going to use it, right? And so that tells me that there's sort of a imperative on the faculty to think about not just their teaching practices, which you've heard a lot about, but the actual curriculum and the skills and how the disciplines themselves are shifting to this new sort of world order, if you will. So can you say a little bit about whether that came up in the discussions of the task force? And if not, what would the next task force need to do to sort of really more deeply understand to what extent the classes and the curriculum and the skills, both the content and how they're taught, might change? Thanks.
Yeah, I think I would say, that study is less than a month old, so or maybe 2 months. It's fairly recent. And so I think that we're still reacting and digesting that. There were early indications. It's resonant with earlier studies about both writing and programming that found similar effects. This one was better powered and with a big brand name. So I think it's driven a lot of conversations. I'll let the other committee members and Bree speak as well, but I think one thing about UVA is the decentralized nature of the place, right? That the provost office and the president's office trust the units to make their own policies and curriculum. So I think should be driven by the schools and by the needs of the schools. Again, professional schools like Reza and I think have a particular imperative here. I mean, when I shared that study, I believe strongly in evidence-based teaching, and I now think genuinely that it would be now malpractice for our curriculum to not include these skills. We're just not serving our students well, as the evidence has clearly showed. And there's now a small corpus, but a corpus that's moving us in that direction. I think one of the things that we recommended and that I've seen a lot of progress on is that through Bree's work and the work of the other folks like Reza, is that there's now a teaching at teaching.virginia.edu. There are school and subject-specific primers, which I think, Reza, you've made one, so maybe it'd be best to speak on this, about how to do this in our particular units. I will finish my comment here by saying, I think, like Reza, it needs to be a curricular level conversation, not an individual faculty level conversation, in large point because of the equity concerns, which are both about access, but also a student who runs through one set of instructors through the curriculum might get a lot of background, say you're with me, another instructor might do none. And so if we're not building in that as a core curricular competency, we're leaving it to chance, we're leaving it to privilege of background based on these things. And in that way, I don't think we're being an equitable institution in ways that really matter for our students.
If I could just add one more thing in line with what Andrew mentioned. So at the time, this is like, just past summer, there were no studies. I mean, I think there was just one famous study was about GitHub Copilot and how programmers are using this, which was kind of like really understandable and expected. But I think that these types of studies, like as more companies are actually using them, and these are just like very early studies, meaning that the companies, their workers, they all get better and better at using these tools, and like whatever these researchers are finding, they're going to be even more magnified. So I think during the conversation we had in the task force, we couldn't focus on this as much just because there was no data for us. But I think the other efforts Bree and her team are doing, I think that's kind of like incorporating that a little bit more.
Hi, can I go next? Hi, my name is Vishal over here. Yeah, so far I have heard a lot of interesting discussion about how students can use generative AI to improve and enhance their learning process. But one of the things I'm also thinking about as an educator is how teachers can use generative AI to improve the teaching process itself. Are there things that we can do as educators to bring generative AI, not just advise students and help them excel at their, getting ready for the workplace by using generative AI, but also integrate generative AI, incorporate it into the teaching process itself? Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I would just start with, I think personally, I think we can actually look at this in two different ways. The first thing is defining Gen AI proficiency as a learning objective in most of the courses that would be exposed to Gen AI. And then the second thing is how the other learning objectives could be augmented by generative AI. So as an instructor, then, so I'm just like giving that sort of intro to kind of say how the instructors need to approach this if they wanted to do this. So as an instructor, the first thing is to figure out how much my course or like whatever I'm teaching to my students and like eventually whatever task they are going to be engaged in is going to be exposed to generative AI, because I think that would be quite critical to start with. If I'm teaching a course that would be drastically exposed or transformed through generative AI, then my generative AI skills should be also upgraded, to the same extent. But if I'm like teaching something that is not as exposed, I think that would be essentially something that a basic foundation in generative AI, I think that would be sufficient. So in the task force, I don't think we had like some recommendations for the university in terms of like how to educate our instructors in terms of like learning generative AI. What are the kind of programs that would be helpful to help our instructors to learn about generative AI and how they could leverage generative AI in their teaching. But at the time, in the task force, based on what I remember, we were basically looking at the way instructors were using it at the moment. And what stood out was basically, again, the variation in the ways instructors are using these tools. Some of them are using them at a very high level. Some of them are just using them to kind of like organize student submissions and things like that.
When I think about that question, I think about, let's imagine a world in which all UVA instructors know how to do excellent evidence-based teaching. What a great world. But what stands in the way of that sometimes is the amount of effort that it takes. And so to the extent that we can reduce the cost of those tasks to be able to execute those excellent plans, I think generative AI can be enormously helpful. Let's say you're my friend Peter Johannesson, you're teaching a 130 person introductory class, and you get the exams back. Your graders go through, they do all the marking up, they tell you what it is, you can see some of the challenges. But imagine a world in which we have a university site license and he can upload all of those things and say, when I come into class after the exam, what are the 3 things I need to follow up with about students that they didn't get right that I should teach on again? He could read 130 exams, allegedly, he has small children, as I do, but that would just make things so much faster. So he could do the thing that would be the best practice, but do it in a way that's feasible. In a similar way, if he's coming into a conversation and he's, like, let's say he's letting his TAs lead a conversation, he's read the articles, he can come up with some discussion questions for them to use, also upload both into Claude and say, what are a couple of things that my students could talk about, what are some discussion starter questions, what might be the tricky spots, and hand that off to the TAs relatively quickly. Of course, as the expert, he's going to go back and double check those things, but he's able to do that in a real way that I think, and those are different examples of, I think, being faster. Another thing that I didn't mention from the BCG study is that one of the really interesting findings was that the top performers saw, I think it was a 13% increase in performance, but the bottom half of pretest performers saw a 60% increase in performance. And so you can imagine there are parts of our jobs where we're really skilled, where AI might not help us that much. But there are probably parts of our jobs where we're not particularly skilled, and AI could help us a lot. And so that leveling effect across things we're not great at could, again, create time for us. Because what I hear from my colleagues consistently is, I don't want more money, I want more time. There's just not enough space for us to live our lives, to do the work we want to do. And so the ability to make better teaching faster is the promise of being able to do the other things in research in other spaces. So I think that is a way I see it being helpful, and what some people have termed the mechanical professor, right? This disjoining of AI and professors for greater productivity in the classroom specifically.
Can I just say one thing as a quick follow-up to that? And this is because you mentioned evidence-based teaching. So I see the door is open. I'm hoping that no one overhears this. I have a secret mission. So part of my charge in my position is to try to ensure that we have excellent teaching across the university. And what I am hoping to use this moment to do is to take an opportunity to kind of smuggle in under the guise of this technology some teaching practices that we already know are best practices. So I'll just share one example, which is we know that a focus on the process of writing a paper and not just on the product, the end paper, actually improves students' writing and their comprehension skills. And so if you're concerned about generative AI, one thing to do is to have your students break down the process of writing a paper into several stages, submit each stage. If they want to use the AI, you can allow them to use the AI, talk about how they used it, talk about how they responded to it, and then get them through these various stages to the end product with evaluations at each stage and engagement at each stage, as opposed to just saying, go off and write a 10-page paper and give it to me when you're done. So thinking about possible upsides of this technology would be to kind of smuggle in under the guise of this technology what it is that we want our faculty to be doing anyway. But don't tell anybody.
I think those last two questions really fed into what I was already wanting to ask, which is, I was an undergrad before ChatGPT, but I remember my parents still joking about how easy I had it in a lot of ways. They would talk about, they were old enough that they were using typewriters for a lot of their papers, and the resources they had were what the library had available or what they could get quick enough to write a paper. And the argument and the joke always back and forth between my dad was like, yes, those things are easier, but at the same time, the bar's been raised in a lot of ways. So functionally, there was no room for error on typos. We had Microsoft Word. Professors were not okay with, basic grammatical errors. Missed citations was not something that was ever tolerated. Some of those small things, but similarly, instead of just having, 3 resources to back up your paper, the expectation was you were finding the highest quality resources to back up because you had the vastness of the internet to do so. And so listening to you talk about, how these tools can help both students and professors, in the long term, do you just see the bar for university students being raised much higher, where maybe in an introduction computer science course you used to write a project with 1,000 lines of code, but now because you have these tools that make you 50% more productive and 50% better, maybe the bar now is 3,000 lines of code to accomplish the same thing? Do you think maybe in 10, 20 years we're just looking at a step function increase in really the productivity and the expectation of university students? And I guess, how long do you think until we start seeing that bar raised, if you think it's going to be?
I'll start, I guess. So yeah, I definitely see that, at least like in the course that I teach. I feel like the bar is raising, just because I know whatever they used to do like 2 years ago, it's just like much easier to do now. And then the other thing is, some of the students, so we have like, let's say A pluses, and then we have B pluses and so forth. So those A pluses or A's, they use these tools to kind of like learn more advanced things, and then they ask us questions about those kind of things. And then I kind of like find myself in this position of, do I want to talk about this very advanced topic that I was not planning to do? And I think gradually, if I get more of those types of questions, I would actually, adjust my content and curriculum, just because I know my students can learn, let's say, classification algorithms and things like that, instead of like spending 2 days on this, resource. They can just, learn it in 5 hours, right? So we want to fill the other hours with, something else. And that's how I would see, the bar would raise.
I think I would, in the technical areas, I'm not sure how to respond because I'm not a technologist. I could certainly see, when I started teaching research methods, a student told me, it's like you're speaking Greek and I'm trying to read Hebrew at the same time. There was so much to learn on the technical side of it as well as the other side. And so if we can teach the conceptual side, but have the computer write the code, then we may be able to move on to more advanced topics more quickly. A different way to look at that is in a non-technical course, you might say, well, everybody now, because of like the tutoring aspects, for example, everybody can now has the access to the resources to be an A student. Maybe they weren't able to, it's able to bring people up to the same bar, but maybe that bar isn't higher. One can imagine that case. I can also imagine courses for which that's not the case. Again, like to Bree's point from earlier, I don't think, I don't know why I'm on Jane Austen kick this afternoon, but I think engaging in literature or philosophy or community are things that are not going to be accelerated in that same way. I think that's about development and shaping people and who they are, what they care for, what their values are. And I'm not sure technology is the barrier that's keeping us from maybe being where we want to be there.
I'm not sure. I think I'm quite frankly too young to have enough scope on this issue to answer anything well. But I'll give it my best shot. I think it is interesting that some of the reactions to ChatGPT were to actually take a step back from technology, and we saw professors moving from like online exams or take-home exams to like in-person handwritten. I knew a professor who, for the first time in years, did oral exams in his class. And so it may frankly be too early on this issue to figure out how, at least my perspective is that of a humanities major, of how that space is going to change. I don't know.
So I wonder if I could ask each of our panelists, and I did not prepare this question for you, so I'm spraying this on you. When you think about the University of Virginia 10 years from now, so 2033, what does it look like and how is it different other than we will have more buildings at Emmett Ivy?
Reza and I will be full professors at that point as well, right?
We'll have endowed chairs, both of you, yeah.
I would just start again. It's basically like avoiding answering that question just because the technology itself is changing so much. I could see AGI even before 10 years from now, and I think that would be a more philosophical. It would be actually a great question for you, Bree. Yeah, I mean, based on the pace of the advancement in these models and like the way they're being incorporated and integrated into different businesses, I think it's very difficult to predict like 10 years from now. I'm actually struggling to figure out like in 2 years or 3 years where we're going to be, and so it all depends on the way the technology would evolve. So it's kind of like I don't have like data or any insights to be able to comment on this, but I know that, this on November 7th, OpenAI announced GPT-4 Turbo, which is like going to be a lot more powerful than GPT-4. In a couple of weeks from now, Google is going to announce Gemini, which they say is the best thing. And then, some of you who basically have friends in these tech companies would know that these models they release, they're not necessarily their best models. I mean, they are essentially some of the models that go through certain processes to kind of like make them a little bit more polished and safe. They are not like the pure model they built. And the pure model they built is actually even more powerful from what they release. So that's the reason why I actually do not know how different things are going to fit. Especially, it was like I didn't think about this question before this session, so I struggle even more to answer that question.
I think I would just add that one of the terms I've learned in this process is a general purpose technology, along the lines of the electricity which is a thing that's invented, but it enables an enormous number of different things that can come from it. In the same way that our iPhones were originally, like here's a cool way to make a phone call and you can look at a picture of your kid. Like now there's so many more things in that. And so I think we have not yet envisioned, the technology is not mature, and there are things that we can think about. We think, oh, it'll be better at citations, right? Like ChatGPT 3.5 got 80% of the citations wrong, and 4 gets 80% wrong, and how soon will we get to 100%? But I think in some ways that's the fundamentally wrong question. The question is, what are the other ways in which people might use it that we're not thinking about? And so as ChatGPT has just rolled out its GPTs, which I think is the right way to say that, where users can begin to mold prompts like I could provide a prompt. I wrote a book on writing and public policy. So I could create a prompt that would help government folks write better based on all the things that I have in the background. That's the kind of thing that we haven't really envisioned yet. And I just think there are multiples of that coming across every domain that will affect every part of the university. Yeah. And so I do think it is, I tell my students that that they were born, they've never known a world without social media. But they're in this weird spot that they've known the world before generative AI. And that every student that will be at this, in 4 years, every student who will be at this university will have co-written their application essays with AI. And so it's going to shape the university profoundly in how we come to ask questions, like what is the sort of the grammar, if you will, of how we approach the world and how we ask questions. And so I think it's a really unique moment. It's really exciting to live through, but I also feel like there's a fog about as far as the walls of this room, and that's about as much as I can see.
I'll temper the excitement a little bit. I cannot make good predictions on the technology front. I have a feeling y'all are all much better at that than I am. I'm worried about what generative AI might do or the impacts it might have on the relationships formed in academic settings. We've talked a lot about generative AI as a tutor. Well, that means, are you going to your TA's office? Are you building a relationship with your faculty members? And that is, short-term observations based on the technology that exists right now. And so how do we preserve the collegiate aspects of learning and our ability to learn from other people and not just from technology? I think there are probably great ways out there to safeguard against that, but that is the major anxiety I have about what universities might look like in 10 years.
Thank you.
+1. I don't know if that's what you still say, but +1 to that.
More questions for our panel?
Hey there. So maybe instead of 10 years into the future, I'm actually kind of curious about the next couple of months in your all's head. I'm an LLM researcher at Stanford, so we're actively building features and trying to solve the big problems that we think are in this space. In particular, I work on reliability and truth with LLMs, because I think if we don't solve that, it's not going to, we're not going to get to scale in education. So let's say you wave a magic wand. There's people in the room here. I met an undergrad who was sort of thinking about going into this space. So I think some of the things on your wish list might be being built. What's top of your wish list for Gen AI that you think is not there right now, and if it came out in the next 3 months in a feature and something that that you're working on would make your lives easier or your students' lives transformed educationally?
Great question.
So I would take that again. I think that the thing that LLMs are missing is essentially they cannot stand their ground, meaning that if you prompt them to say something and they say it, and then you say, oh, it's incorrect, and I want you to say something else, they would say, my apologies, I'm so dumb, here's what you wanted, right? So they don't know how to stand their ground, and I think until they reach that level, they can justify and essentially argue with you in terms of convincing you that what you are thinking is actually wrong or incorrect, and what I'm saying is correct. it's a very, I guess, difficult sort of thing to achieve. But I think at that point I would be really, really surprised, and I would be really, really interested to learn more, what I can do with this thing.
I think AI that could, close to that, explain its work, like where it gets information, and sort of just revealing what's inside the black box would be fascinating.
Yeah, I think just to, that there are some methods basically for that. I mean, it would also, you can just prompt it to kind of like tell you why it made this comment or something like that. But the thing is, it wouldn't stick to it. I mean, it's just like, if you ask it to change its opinion, it would, right? And I think that's a problem. I mean, we, as humans, we don't behave this way. And I think that's the fundamental and the most important difference that I can see between this type of technology. I mean, it's kind of like make them closer to stochastic parrots than, intelligent beings, right? So that's kind of like, the way I see this.
I think I don't have an answer on exactly what you're asking. I think the way that I see it being more and more applicable to my graduate students and to myself are, I don't know the right words here, but things that are layered on top of a generative AI. I think there are some really provocative scholarship tools like elicit, not illicit, do not Google illicit.org, but elicits, like eliciting the good research, that those are enormously helpful. I would love them to be better trained, and they don't really mimic the way that scholars in the field think yet. But that's the kind of thing where I think, okay, this general purpose technology is now solving a task that's key in the same way I think the coding has been early on this, because it's been clearly connected. I think as it gets nuanced in these specific spaces and fields, those are where my students, again, training for government and consulting, are really going to find the most value.
So many educators say that they place a greater importance on teaching students how to think rather than just what to think. And there could be a tendency to use these tools to just be lazy as opposed to enhancing critical thinking. So to what extent do you think there can be best practices with these tools to actually sharpen critical thinking rather than just give you the easy out?
I agree with you, and I don't want to come off as a Pollyanna-ish voice in this, because I do think there are critical challenges. Bree pointed to some of the language in the report as ominous, and one of our kind of lines that I really liked was, there's a potential for students to learn more this coming year than they ever have at UVA, but there's also potential to learn a lot less. And I think you're pointing to how do we guard against the downside risk of this technology in the classroom. I'll just say very practically, one way that I've been impressed that my students have used it is, we know that we ought to get a diverse set of views on a problem, but the process of going through what are those diverse set of views is, from a classroom perspective, sometimes opaque. How might we go about representing those voices differently? And so they're using ChatGPT to say, what would a person, say we're doing a school board policy, none of them are parents, at least in my classroom, what would a parent have to say about this? What would a legislator have to say about this? What would somebody from this interest group have to say about this? And those things, we can quibble with, certainly those may or may not be right, they may be biased in important ways, but it's a way to begin to engage in stakeholding perspectives in a way that I haven't seen students in 15 years of doing this be that broad-minded and specific, and it's driving better critical thinking conversations in our classroom, because they're able to kind of iterate and go back and forth in a way that does generate critical thinking. I think a lot of this does drive back to our learning designs and the very practicalities. I mean, I think the Blue Books, going back to Blue Books, is certainly some of my colleagues have done that. I can see spaces where I could support that. I can also see ways that we might think about other learning designs that could continue the critical thinking, like what Bree was talking about, that kind of mash it up in a different and better way. You know, very early on, what lots of people were saying is, we know it's going to give us a bad output. Let's then critique the bad output, and then that'll be the critical thinking. I think the more developed the LLMs get, the less that's going to be a tool we can go back on, but people are definitely thinking about these things.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think over time, long term, it's probably going to reinforce critical thinking than just because, people are going to do more. And then if I'm not learning how to learn the foundation, right? So if I don't know what the foundation is, then I cannot use this tool effectively. And then all my peers, they're cruising through, they know the foundation, they know how to use the tool. So I think over time, it's probably going to be beneficial, and I don't see the majority, the body of the students would use it to just avoid critical thinking or substitute it.
One of the things we said in the report, which I hope at least is still true, is that students are still going to come to the University of Virginia not just for the credential, but to be fundamentally shaped by the community and the mission of the school, of the university, and then the schools themselves. And so I hope, at least the hopeful part of me hopes there's still intrinsic motivation for students to learn those critical thinking skills, particularly as we situate them in serving communities, we situate them serving the common good in ways that I hope that they'll continue doing, to not just try to bypass when we align them and say, hey, these are the reasons we want. This is actually congruent with where you want to go in life and what your values are. So, hey, let's do this critical thinking maybe outside of the AI for a minute. I'm still maybe naively, but hopeful about that.
So, Phil?
Sort of helping you wrap up a bit too, but just hearing all this, by the way, absolutely fascinating discussion, thank you. But it makes me think, particularly as you asked the question about in the next 5 or 10 years, we actually, the provost was here earlier, and we, at the beginning of the day, and we announced this Futures Initiative, which is trying to get ahead and look 5 to 10 years out, which of course, as you're pointing out, is very difficult. But it makes me think we need, I mean, I know that the task force did a lot of work, it's an incredible report, but things are changing so fast, we need to really be almost a standing task force, at least a standing group that's really looking at the implications of all of this as it goes along. Because, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking, well, we had similar discussions about the emergence of social media. We didn't actually get to the point of actually realizing some of the things that were going to happen, both good and bad. And, I think this is clearly going to be the case here. I mean, we're just at the very beginning of what this is. And so one aspect, just for example, that I'm listening here thinking about is with respect to teaching and learning, as these models get better and better and better, what it means to be a teacher, you've been doing a lot of this, talking about this, what it means to be a teacher, what it means to learn, actually even begins to question what it means to be human. And, that sort of, how that's going to affect the mental state of the well-being of our faculty and students is something that we really need to keep a tab on as we go forward. And I don't know whether there's any discussions about that, how that sort of thing should happen.
Great, thank you. So I can say a little bit about that. I'm tempted to address the what it means to be a human question, but I'm not wearing my philosophy hat very much these days, so let me talk a little bit from the administrative point of view. So I am working with a faculty group, a group of faculty and also some staff who are seasoned instructional designers here on a series of modules intended for UVA faculty to educate UVA faculty about AI, kind of basic AI literacy. What is it, where is it going, how does it work? I think our professors need to have a basic understanding of the technology, of its basic implications. AI and pedagogy, where looking at, again, what I was mentioning before, sort of smuggling in some pedagogical best practices under the guise of AI, talking about more active learning, things like this. and also the ethical and legal dimensions of AI. So we are working on a series of online modules, more to come, hopefully in a few months on that. We're working as quickly as we can. To your point, we're trying to build something that is flexible, because as soon as it's done, the technology will have leaped ahead. And so something that can be an ongoing resource and some more kind of infrastructure to deliver that. I can't resist just a brief philosophical comment. So as many of you will recall from your philosophy courses as undergraduates, which I hope that all of you had, Aristotle thought that humans were rational animals. So Aristotle thought, what is special about a human being? Well, a human being's an animal. There are other kinds of animals. What's special about us is our rationality. And so with that sort of context, it's fascinating when people talk about artificial intelligence and they say, well, it's not human because it doesn't have consciousness, it doesn't have emotions, it doesn't feel pain. So actually pointing to the aspects of human beings that are more like animals and less like rationality. And so to this earlier question of if we could create an AI, there are some ways in which AIs currently fall short of us, so they don't stand their ground, as Reza said, right? They don't cite their sources reliably, that sort of thing. But I would hope that we would have AIs that actually improve upon us in not having the kind of cognitive biases that we have, right? In being more objective, and so in actually being, in those senses, more rational than we are. But I absolutely agree that the emergence of this technology has real questions about not only what it means to be human, but what does it mean to be a teacher? And if what it means to be a teacher maybe is not delivering content in a single direction for the students to absorb, maybe it's something that ties in more with being emotionally connected with students, being on a journey with students of learning.
Sounds like a good optimistic note to end on.
No?
So please join me in thanking the panel for an absolutely outstanding session.